15 years ago, after my dad passed away, my mom remarried just 3 weeks later, moving her new husband and his child into our lives. Now, she's reaching out to reconnect. I remember the day my parents sat down with my sister Emma and me to tell us they were divorcing. I was 7, and even at that age, you can sense when things are crumbling. Emma was 9 and put on a brave front, trying not to cry, but I could see her pain. We were both hurting. They gave us the "it's not your fault" talk, as if hearing that could somehow make things better. It didn't. After the divorce, life was tough. We stayed with Mom, who tried her best to keep things going, but it was clear she was struggling. She worked long hours, and when she was home, she was exhausted or simply uninterested in spending time with us. Our family turned into just 3 people sharing a house, like Dad had taken with him the glue that held everything together when he left. A few years passed, and that's when Brian entered the picture. Initially, I didn't pay much attention. We were kids, and it's not like Mom's dating life concerned us. But one evening, she introduced him over dinner. Brian seemed like a decent guy, though quiet and awkward, almost like he wasn't sure how to interact with kids. I sat there wondering what made him so special. But Brian wasn't the main issue. It was Mason, his baby son. Mason was only a few months old when Mom and Brian started dating, and she instantly became fixated on him. She went into full, nonstop mom mode as if she was starting fresh with parenting. Emma and I just stood by, watching and thinking, what's going on? She acted like Mason was her own child. I get that Brian and Mason came as a package, but it felt like we were cast aside for a baby who wasn't even ours. I remember one evening, sitting at the table doing homework while Mason cried, and Mom was completely focused on comforting him, rocking and soothing him. I couldn't help but think, where was this attention when we needed it? Things moved quickly between Mom and Brian. Before long, she started talking about us all being a family and how thrilled she was about this new chapter in her life. She didn't ask how we felt about it, though. Emma was old enough to be angry, but I was mostly confused. One minute, it was just Mom, Emma, and me, and the next, there was this stranger and his baby living in our home. Everything was changing, and we had no say in it. When Mom and Brian got engaged, things grew even stranger. She was ecstatic, like it was the best moment of her life. She immediately began planning the wedding, not even asking what we thought. We were just along for the ride, as if our opinions didn't matter. Right before the wedding, my dad died in a car accident. It was horrible timing. We were devastated. Emma was a mess, and I didn't know how to cope either. Dad might not have been around much after the divorce, but he was still our dad. Losing him hit us hard. You'd think that under these circumstances, Mom would have postponed the wedding to let us grieve. But no, she didn't hesitate. The wedding went on as scheduled. I'll never forget how heartless that felt. She was all smiles, planning her big day with Brian, while Emma and I barely held it together. I remember thinking, is this really happening? Is this her priority right now? On the wedding day, it felt surreal. Just weeks after our dad's death, we were standing in fancy clothes, watching Mom marry someone else. I don't think Emma or I said a word the whole day. The ceremony felt off. Brian's family was there, doting on Mason like he was the star, while Emma and I struggled not to cry. This was the point when everything truly changed. After the wedding, Mom told us something that still shocks me. She said that if we wanted to keep seeing Dad's parents, we'd have to bring Mason along. She outright told us that we couldn't visit our grandparents unless Mason was part of it. Emma lost it, yelling at her for what felt like 5 solid minutes. And honestly, I don't blame her. It felt like Mom was trying to erase Dad completely, replacing him with Brian and Mason. Our grandparents tried reasoning with her. They offered to take only Emma and me for weekends, like before, even covering all the costs, but Mom wouldn't budge. She insisted that if they wanted to see us, they had to see Mason too. I'll never forget the look on Emma's face when she heard that it was like the final straw. Mom's reasoning was that we were all family now, and Mason was part of that. But the truth was, he wasn't family to us. He wasn't Dad's child and never knew him, so why did he need to be involved in everything related to Dad's side of the family? It didn't make sense, and no matter how we tried to explain, Mom wouldn't listen. After that, Emma and I started pulling away. We didn't want to be part of the fake family dynamic Mom was forcing on us. It felt like Mason was her priority now, and we were just the extra kids she had to manage. It felt like we were gradually being pushed out of her life, and there wasn't much we could do to change it. Looking back, I realized that was the beginning of the end of our relationship with Mom. She was so invested in building her new life with Brian and Mason that she either didn't notice we were slipping away or simply didn't care. Regardless, nothing was ever the same afterward. Once the wedding was over, things became even more uncomfortable between me, Emma, and Mom. She seemed to expect us to seamlessly adjust to this new setup with Brian, as if we could just instantly feel like one big happy family. Spoiler, that never happened. Instead, Mom began pushing hard for this concept of family unity, constantly reminding us to treat Mason as if he were our little brother. It just didn't feel right. Sure, Mason was a sweet kid, but he wasn't our brother. He wasn't Dad's son, he was just Brian's child. I'm not sure if Mom thought we'd forget about Dad, or if she genuinely believed we'd develop a bond with Mason as if he'd been with us all along, but that's not how it works. One specific day stands out that really impacted me. It was Dad's birthday, a day that was always sacred to us, even after the divorce. Emma and I would spend it with Dad's family, our grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, people who knew and loved him. We'd go to his favorite restaurant, sometimes visit his grave, and just reminisce to keep his memory alive. But this year, Mom had other plans. A week before, she told us we'd be celebrating Dad's birthday together at home with Brian and Mason. My heart sank. This was supposed to be our time with Dad's family. Mason hadn't even known Dad, and Brian barely knew him. It felt like a slap in the face. Emma was the first to speak up, and she didn't hold back. She asked, "Why would Mason be there?" "This isn't about him," Mom quickly responded. "Mason is part of this family now, and we honor your father together. We don't exclude anyone here." I wanted to argue, but knew where it would lead. For months, Emma and I had been having the same arguments with her, and no matter what we said, she'd twist it to make us seem selfish or like we didn't want to include Mason. It was frustrating because it wasn't about Mason, we just didn't want to force him into something that wasn't his. More than that, we didn't want our dad's memory to be turned into some awkward blended family event that felt artificial. I tried to stay calm and reason with her. I said, "Mom, Dad's birthday has always been a time for his side of the family. They supported us when he died, and it means a lot to keep that going. Mason doesn't need to be there." She looked at me as if I'd said something terrible. "Lucas, you don't decide who's part of this family. If you want to honor your dad, you do it with all of us or not at all." At that moment, I knew there was no winning. She was set on including Mason and Brian in this, no matter how senseless it felt to us. So we did the only thing we could. We stopped fighting it. We decided to go along with her plan for now, planning to do something on our own later. Dad's birthday came, and honestly, it was one of the most uncomfortable days of my life. Mom prepared a big meal, and we all sat around like it was some kind of family gathering. Brian tried talking to us about Dad, as if he'd known him, which was just awkward. I kept my eyes on my plate, counting the minutes until I could leave. Then there was Mason, just running around clueless, acting like any typical 3-year-old, not understanding that this day wasn't about him. I couldn't even be mad at him. It wasn't his fault, but it still felt wrong for him to be there. After dinner, Mom brought out a birthday cake with "Happy Birthday, Dad" written on it. She made all of us, including Mason, gather to sing. I stood there, barely mouthing the words, trying to hold it together. It felt like she was rewriting history, forcing this fake story that Brian and Mason were somehow part of Dad's life, which they weren't. Emma had an even harder time. She couldn't take it and left halfway through the evening. I stayed, not wanting to cause more drama, but I wished I'd gone with her. After that birthday, things only got worse. Mom kept involving Mason in more of our traditions, and each time Emma or I pushed back, she'd accuse us of being unkind or insensitive, saying things like, "Mason's just a little boy. How can you be so cruel to him?" She refused to see what we were really upset about. It wasn't about Mason. It was about how she was replacing Dad's memory with her new life, and we were expected to go along with it without question. That's when I realized something that stayed with me. This wasn't just about blending families for Mom, it was about control. She wanted to dictate how we remembered Dad, how we lived, and how we fit into her new vision of family. If we didn't conform, we were labeled the bad ones. Back then, I didn't know how to deal with it. I just knew I was angry at her for forcing Mason into everything, angry at Brian for supporting it, and angry at myself for not standing up to her more. But what could I do? I was just a kid, holding on to the little pieces of my old life that were left. The more I tried to cling to them, the more they seemed to slip away. That year changed everything. Emma and I began distancing ourselves more and more from Mom and her new family. It wasn't the breaking point yet, but it was the start of us realizing that things would never go back to how they were. As time went on, it only got worse. Mom seemed determined to push this new family on us, regardless of how much Emma and I struggled with it. I don't think she understood, or maybe she just didn't care how much this forced blending was affecting us. We couldn't just magically accept Brian and Mason as replacements for Dad, but she acted like we were the ones making things difficult. By the time I reached 18, I felt like I'd hit my breaking point. The house didn't even feel like mine anymore. It was as if Brian had taken over, with everything centering on him and Mason. Brian wasn't a bad guy, but he wasn't my dad. He had his own way of doing things, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was a stranger in what used to be my home. Every rule, every decision, it was always Brian says this or Brian thinks that. I didn't care what Brian thought, I just wanted my life back, the one where my opinions counted. One day, I was in my room, packing some of my things, getting ready to move in with my girlfriend Jess. I wasn't leaving because I didn't love my mom, I did, but I needed space. It felt like the walls were closing in, and I couldn't breathe with everything happening in that house. Jess and I had been planning this move for months, and I was finally ready to leave. As I packed, Mom came into my room, and from her expression, I knew she wasn't happy about it. "So, you're really going through with this?" she asked, crossing her arms. I nodded. "Yeah, Mom." It's time. She stood there silently, watching me pack, then sighed and said, "I don't understand why you're running away from your family." That word, family, hit me hard. I stopped packing, looked at her, and said, "I'm not running away from family, but this doesn't feel like my family anymore." She looked shocked, like I'd slapped her. "What are you talking about? Of course this is your family. We're all in this together," she insisted. I couldn't believe she still didn't understand. "Mom, ever since you married Brian, everything has been about him and Mason. It's like Emma and I don't matter anymore, we're just here. You're trying to replace Dad with them, and I can't handle it." She shook her head in frustration. "I'm not trying to replace your father, I just want us to be a family. Why can't you see that?" I struggled to explain. It wasn't that I didn't want a family, I just didn't want this forced version of it. "I don't feel like I'm part of this family," I said, trying to keep calm. "I feel like I'm living in someone else's life." She looked like she was going to argue again, but then sighed and sat down on my bed. "I just want you to be happy," she said softly. "I want us all to be happy, I know, Mom," I said, my tone softening, "but I'm not happy here. I need space. I need to figure things out on my own." We sat quietly for a while. I could tell she didn't want me to go, but at the same time, she knew my mind was made up. Eventually, she got up and left the room without saying anything else. I went back to packing, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt her, but I couldn't keep living like this. Moving in with Jess felt like a fresh start. I finally had my own space, a place where I could be myself without all the family drama. Jess understood what I was going through and supported me every step of the way. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. But of course, the peace didn't last long. About a week after I moved out, Mom called. She wasn't happy. She told me I hadn't been around enough to see Mason, and that he missed me. She insisted I needed to make an effort to include him in my life. I couldn't believe it even after I left. She was still pushing this "Mason is your brother" idea. I didn't hate the kid, but I didn't see him as my brother, and I wasn't going to pretend I did just to make Mom happy. I tried to explain that I needed space, that I was focusing on my own life, but she wouldn't listen. She kept talking about how Mason was hurt and how I was abandoning my family. The guilt trips were constant, but I wasn't giving in this time. I'd finally gotten out, and I wasn't going back. Things stayed tense after that. I didn't go back to the house or visit much. Emma had already started pulling away too. She wasn't as outspoken as I was, but she felt the same way. It felt like we were slowly being replaced in Mom's life, with Mason taking our place. It hurt, but what could we do? Mom had made her choice, and we'd made ours. For a few months, things were quiet. I thought maybe we'd finally found some sort of balance, Mom with her new family, and me with my own life. But then, out of nowhere, she showed up at my job. I was in the middle of my shift when she walked in, looking furious. I didn't know what had set her off this time, but I knew I was about to find out. "We need to talk," she said. crossing her arms and glaring at me. I sighed. Mom, I'm at work. Can't this wait? No, it can't, she snapped back. I'm tired of you ignoring your family. Here we go again. I tried to keep my voice calm. I'm not ignoring my family. I've just been busy. Too busy to see your own brother, she countered. I clenched my jaw. Mason is not my brother. That was the last straw. Mom's face turned red, and I could see her hands shaking. How dare you say that? I raised him like he was my own son. He is your brother, and you're acting like he doesn't even exist. I'd had enough. I wasn't going to let her guilt trip me into something I didn't believe. Look, I didn't ask for this, okay? I didn't ask for you to remarry or bring Mason into our lives. I'm not saying I hate him, but he's not my brother. He's Brian's son, and I don't have to include him in my life if I don't want to. Mom stood there, staring at me as if I were a stranger. I can't believe you've turned into this person, she said quietly. I thought I raised you better than this. I didn't know how to respond. I looked at her and simply said, maybe you didn't raise me at all. Update 1. After that confrontation with Mom at my job, things between us got worse. I didn't think they could, but here we were. The tension had been simmering for years, but now it felt like we were locked in a silent battle. She wasn't talking to me, and I wasn't making an effort to reach out either. It felt like something had broken that couldn't be fixed, and honestly, I didn't have the energy to try. A couple of weeks passed, and I thought maybe we'd just leave things as they were. I didn't mind the silence. For once, I finally had some space, and I could focus on my own life without all the family drama weighing me down. But of course, it wasn't going to stay quiet for long. Mom always had a way of pulling you back in, whether you wanted it or not. One night, I was unwinding at home with Jess after a long day when my phone suddenly started buzzing nonstop with texts. It was Mom. She hadn't reached out since our last argument, so I knew this wasn't going to be anything pleasant. At first, I didn't even want to read them, but the alerts kept coming, so eventually, I gave in. The messages were extensive, and I had to scroll for quite a while to get through it all. She was going on about how I'd abandoned the family, how Mason was wondering where I was and why I hadn't been visiting. She claimed I was hurting him by staying away and accused me of being heartless toward a little kid who hadn't done anything wrong. I just sat there, drained, staring at my phone. It was the same conversation on repeat. She couldn't accept that I didn't view Mason as my brother, and she just wouldn't drop it. Now, she was making me out to be the bad guy for not fitting into her idea of a perfect family. I didn't even know how to respond. Jess, sitting next to me, noticed my expression and asked, "Is it your mom again?" I nodded. Yeah, she's saying the same stuff, that I'm being unfair to Mason, that I'm hurting the family. Jess rolled her eyes. She doesn't get it. Does she? Nope, I replied, tossing my phone on the table. She's never going to get it. Jess put a hand on my shoulder. You don't owe her anything. You've done everything you can to explain how you feel. If she doesn't want to listen, that's her choice. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it any easier. There was always that nagging guilt. Even though I knew Mom was wrong, part of me still felt like the bad guy. I didn't want to hurt Mason or make him feel left out, but I couldn't keep pretending this situation was normal. A few days later, things took a turn. Mom started calling me, and I ignored the first few calls, figuring it was the same argument again. But then she left a voicemail that caught me off guard. She wasn't just upset, she was furious, her voice shaking with anger. She said something like, "If you want to be part of this family, you need to step up and stop acting like a child. Mason is your brother, whether you like it or not, and if you keep ignoring him, you're going to lose your family. You're better than this, Lucas. I didn't raise you to be selfish." That last part really got under my skin. Selfish? I had spent years trying to keep the peace, balancing my own needs with what Mom wanted. I'd bent over backward to make things work, and now I was being called selfish just because I didn't want to play along anymore. It felt like everything I'd done for her and the family didn't matter. All she cared about was Mason and the family image she'd built around him. I played the voicemail for Jess that night, and she just shook her head. "She's trying to guilt trip you again," she said. You don't have to listen to that. I knew she was right. I'd been guilted for years, but it was like a reflex now. Part of me still felt like I owed Mom something, even when she was clearly in the wrong. A few days later, something happened that really pushed me over the edge. Mom showed up at Jess's apartment without even calling or texting first. She just appeared at the front door, demanding to talk. Jess opened the door. and I could hear Mom's voice before I even saw her. She was upset and didn't plan on leaving until she got what she wanted. Jess came to get me, looking a bit shaken. "Your mom's here," she said. "And she's kind of freaking out." I didn't want to deal with it, but I couldn't leave her standing outside either. So I went to the door. The moment she saw me, she started in. "We need to talk now," she said, her tone sharp. I didn't invite her in. I just stepped outside and closed the door behind me. "What do you want, Mom?" I asked. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "You need to stop this. This is ridiculous, Lucas. You've cut off your own family for no reason." "I didn't cut off my family," I replied, trying to keep calm. "I just don't want to be part of something that doesn't feel real." Mom threw her hands up. "Mason is real. Brian is real. This is your family, whether you like it or not. I don't care about that," I shot back. "You're trying to force something that I don't believe in. Mason isn't my brother, and Brian isn't my dad. I'm not going to pretend they are just to make you happy." And then she said the thing that really made me snap. "Well, if you can't accept them as family, maybe you don't deserve to be part of this family either." I stood there, stunned, trying to process what she just said. I couldn't believe it. She was willing to throw me away because I wouldn't go along with her version of a family. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and went back inside, closing the door behind me. I could hear her yelling outside, but I didn't care anymore. Something inside me had snapped. All the guilt and pressure were gone. If she wanted to cut me off, fine. I wasn't going to keep fighting for a place in a family that didn't feel like mine. That night, I blocked her number. It wasn't an easy choice, but it was necessary. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Update 2: after I blocked Mom's number, things went completely quiet. I thought she might try to contact me through other people, maybe Jess or Emma, but nothing. It was as if a switch had been flipped, and suddenly, all the drama stopped. At first, it felt strange. I'd become so used to the constant pressure, the guilt tripping, and manipulation, that when it all vanished, I didn't know what to do with myself. But over time, the silence became a relief. I spent more time with Jess, focusing on our life together. For once, I wasn't carrying around the weight of my family's issues. Jess and I could enjoy our time without me constantly checking my phone or stressing over the latest thing Mom had done or said. It finally felt like I was living my own life, not the one Mom had tried to force me into. But of course, peace never lasts forever. A few months later, I got a message from my Aunt Mom's sister. I hadn't talked to her in a while, but we'd always gotten along fairly well. She hadn't taken sides during all the turmoil with Mom, which I was grateful for. The message was brief and somewhat vague. It just said, "Hey, can we talk?" It's important. Sensing something was up, I decided to call her. She picked up on the first ring, and the first thing she asked was, "Lucas, have you talked to your mom recently?" I sighed. "No, I haven't. We're not really in contact anymore." There was a pause on the line, and I could tell she was choosing her words carefully for whatever she was about to say. "Well, I don't want to get involved, but you should probably know that your mom's been telling people you and Emma abandoned her and Mason." I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath. "She's saying we abandoned her?" I asked, my voice tense. "Yeah," my aunt replied gently. "She's telling people she's tried to reach out to you both, but you've been ignoring her, refusing to be part of the family, and that she doesn't know what to do." I couldn't help it. I laughed, even though there was nothing funny about it. Of course, now she's the victim. Classic. "I don't know all the details," Lucas, my aunt replied, sounding a bit defensive. "I'm just letting you know what she's been saying. I didn't want to get involved, but I thought you should hear it from me." "Thanks for letting me know," I said, feeling my frustration building again. "But she's twisting things. She pushed us away the moment we didn't follow her rules. She wanted us to accept Mason as family, and when we didn't, she cut us off." There was another long silence from her end, as if she wasn't sure how to respond. Finally, she said, "Well, I thought it would be better for you to hear it directly than through gossip." "I appreciate it," I replied, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. But honestly, I didn't think there was anything left to fix. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, just thinking. It was hard to wrap my head around the fact that, after everything, Mom was still trying to make us look like the ones in the wrong. It was as if she couldn't accept that she had pushed us away, so instead, she twisted it to look like we were the ones who'd walked out on her. That's when it hit me this wasn't really about Mason or Brian or the family drama at all. This was about control. Mom had always needed to control everything: the story, the family dynamic, how we remembered Dad. And when Emma and I stopped letting her control us, she lost it. A few days after that call with my aunt, I decided to reach out to Emma. We hadn't talked much since everything blew up, but I knew she was going through the same things I was. We arranged to meet for coffee, and when we finally sat down together, it felt like a weight was lifted. Talking to her now felt different, like we were finally on the same page in a way we hadn't been before. I talked to Aunt Sarah, I said once we'd settled into our seats. Emma raised an eyebrow. Oh? What did she say? I told her about the conversation, explaining how Mom was telling people we'd abandoned her. Emma rolled her eyes so hard I thought they'd get stuck. Of course she's playing the victim, she said. She always does. It's never her fault, I know, I replied, shaking my head. But it still makes me so mad. How can she not see that she did this? She's the one who pushed us away. She doesn't want to see it, Emma said, taking a sip of her coffee. She's never going to admit she's wrong. In her mind, she's the perfect mom who's just trying to keep the family together, and we're the ungrateful kids who don't appreciate her. That hit me harder than I expected. Perfect mom, was that how she saw herself? I guess it made sense in her world. She probably believed she was doing everything right, creating this ideal blended family. But the reality was so far from that. I don't even know what to do anymore, I admitted, leaning back in my chair. I've tried everything. I've told her how I feel. I've set boundaries, but nothing changes. She just ignores it and keeps pushing her version of things. Emma nodded. Same here. I've been trying to pull back for years, but every time I do, she plays the victim and makes me feel guilty. We sat in silence for a while, both of us just processing it all. Talking to Emma about it helped, though it made me realize I wasn't alone in this. We were both dealing with the same thing, and neither of us had the answers, but at least we had each other. I guess we just have to accept that this is who she is, Emma said finally. She's not going to change. She's always going to try to control us. And we have to decide how much of that we're willing to tolerate. I nodded. Yeah, I guess you're right. We finished our coffee, and as we walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange sense of closure. I wasn't happy about how things had turned out with Mom, but I didn't feel as angry anymore. I'd done everything I could to make things work, but sometimes, no matter how hard you try, people just won't change, and that's not on you. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could move forward without the weight of this family drama hanging over me. Maybe things with Mom would never be the way they once were, but I had my own life to live, and I wasn't going to let her control that anymore.